Good evening, everybody. Please let us know if you hear me. Professor Flug, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you perfectly.
Okay.
I hope everybody else is hearing us. Yes. Okay, so we will begin. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight marks the second webinar in our series this week and the fifth in the past 2 weeks. If you missed the previous ones, you're welcome to check out the recordings on our YouTube. We will continue to bring you these webinars thanks to our inspiring and informative Hebrew University experts. We can't think of a better way to get a unique and informed perspective on this crisis we are facing around the world. As we know, we are very concerned not only of the issue of public health, but also the implication of the coronavirus on the economy. Today, we have the great pleasure to host Professor Karnit Flug. Professor Flug is the former governor of the Central Bank of Israel and is a senior lecturer in economics at the Hebrew University. Professor Flug will give an inside view on the impact of the coronavirus on the Israeli economy, and hopefully she will share some good news. After her lecture, you're welcome to ask questions raising your digital hand. Thank you all for participating, and Professor Flug, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. As I put in the title, it's just very early thoughts about the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, where it's a very rapidly evolving crisis, and there is a lot that we don't know, but I'll try to give you some of my initial thoughts about what we can know at this stage. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures taken by governments around the globe in an attempt to contain its spread are dragging the world into a rapidly evolving economic crisis. A global recession seems inevitable, but its depth and duration are highly uncertain. The latter will depend on the evolution of the disease, on the severity and the duration of the restrictive measures imposed, and on the nature and the magnitude of economic policy response. And in this respect, Israel is no exception. The first restrictive measures were taken already in early February by restricting the travel from China and then from the rest of Asia. And the phrase that we've been hearing, all of us, I think, across the globe, has been flattening the curve. And the main concern has been to try and slow the spread of the disease so that we will have a slower evolution of the contagion. And in this way, we will reduce the number of people that would need to be in intensive care or taken care by the health system to a level that can be dealt with in terms of the capacity of the healthcare system. The measures have been escalating, and we keep actually getting new restrictions every few days, including tonight, further restrictions. And clearly these measures now have already started having a very substantial economic cost. Much of the economy is shut down. The initial effect of the initial closure of the economy or of the country in terms of its external borders were on specific sectors like tourism and air travel and culture and restaurants. But now with the recent restrictions, which are much broader, basically much of the economic activity is shut down. There are very severe restrictions on movement. There are very severe restrictions on the number of employees that can be in the premises of any establishment. No gatherings are allowed, and so on and so forth. So the economic consequences of this shutdown, together with the very sharp decline in the value of financial assets, and together with the sharp drop in private consumption, partly due to the restrictions on commerce and partly due to the fact that people have been laid off and the uncertainty is soaring, investment is down. So obviously the economic consequences will be very severe. Now, it's very early actually to assess what will be the extent of these economic consequences, because as I already said, the length of the period of restrictions, the severity of restrictions, and as we've seen over the last week, these restrictions keep being intensified, and the measures that the governments and central banks in Israel as well will decide to take to alleviate some of the costs in terms of unemployment insurance and so on. All of these will matter very much to how severe this downturn or recession actually will be. There is a recent estimate, actually it was presented today or yesterday by the Bank of Israel, who made an estimate of what will be the output loss as a result of the restrictions that the government imposed on economic activity. And these measures are only the very direct, or the estimate here refers to the direct effect of the restrictions on economic activity on overall output, on GDP. And what you can see in this table is that the restrictions or the extent of the shutdown is very important in terms of the severity of the decline in output, and also the length of the period in which these restrictions will be in place. So for example, if the level of restrictions are more or less at the level at which they were yesterday, that was presented by the Bank of Israel yesterday, the loss of output as a result of these restrictions, if they only last till the end of April, will be about 50 billion shekels, which is about 3.5% of GDP. If these restrictions are extended until the end of May, the loss is soaring to 90 billion shekels, or 6.4% of GDP. Now, if the restrictions are intensified and the number of economic establishments and businesses that can stay open will be diminished, or the number of employees that can be there in the premises at any given time will be further reduced. Now the restrictions are to 30% of overall employees in every establishment. Then if the restrictions start to be lifted by the end of April, we're already talking about almost 5% of GDP in terms of output loss, and it can reach the incredible proportions of 9% of GDP, 127 billion shekels, if the restrictions will be in place until the end of May. So what you can actually gather from this table is one, the cost of the shutdown, the cost of this attempt to flatten the curve of the number of people that get into hospitals and getting the disease. The cost of these measures is very high, and the severity of the measures and the duration will be crucial. But these are only the direct costs of the restrictions. But as I mentioned, there are also indirect costs which are related to the decline in consumption as the result of the rapid rise in unemployment, because many people are laid off, and uncertainty, which also tends to cause people to sort of reduce sharply their consumption because of fear of what's coming. There are also restrictions on the ability to actually go to the stores. Most of the malls are closed, so consumption is going to be very severely diminished. And if we add to that also the decline in global demand, as I said at the very beginning, and as you all know, we're talking about a global crisis. We already see a very sharp decline in the world trade. So also those companies or those firms that continue to produce now may face difficulties in actually selling because global demand is declining. And all of that together leads to an expectation that we are already in a recession, and the latest estimate, or the estimate that was presented recently by the Bank of Israel, which is based on the least severe scenario, I should add, the scenario that assumes that the restrictions are not intensified and that they start being lifted up or diminished by the end of April. They show that's actually the projection. Let me backtrack for a little and say something about the state of the Israeli economy entering into this crisis. As you all know, the Israeli economy until 3 weeks ago was in a fairly strong shape. We had a fairly solid growth, a very strong labor market, a very low unemployment. In fact, the rate of unemployment was in 2019 3.3%. Employment was at a record high, wages were going up. So the economy, in terms of the real activity, was at a very good stage entering into this crisis. Another areas of strength of the economy were the fact that we have positive or current account surplus. We've had that for a very long time. Our public finances, or government finances, are reasonable. There was some relaxation of fiscal discipline recently, but the debt relative to GDP is at 60%, which is relative to other advanced economies, not a high debt. And also our banks are very strong. They have accumulated capital and liquidity, so they have cushions to withstand a severe shock. So all of these attributes of the economy imply that the economy is quite resilient. And if you are to be faced with a shock, with a severe shock, it's very important that at the starting point you are with a solid economy and with a resilient financial system. So that's important to note before we get into the projections for next year. So you see here the growth rate of the economy in 2019. The Bank of Israel expects a decline of 2.5% in 2020. And again, I want to stress that, that this projection is based on a fairly, I would say, somewhat optimistic assumptions that there is no intensification of the restrictions on economic activity and on movement, and that the restrictions will start being lifted by the end of April. Now, one of the things that one of the phenomena that we've already seen at a very rapid pace over the last week or so is the soaring numbers of people applying for unemployment benefits. Most of these people are temporarily laid off, and some of them are laid off. The number of people that are now seeking unemployment benefit, if we sum them together, they're about 20% of the overall labor force. So if we would count all of them as unemployed, we're talking about unemployment reaching 20%. We haven't been with these numbers for a very, very long time. Now, in terms of the actual measure, those who are temporarily laid off in the official statistics are not counted as unemployed, and therefore the number that is projected here for unemployment, which is an average for the year, is 7%. But again, here, it is expected that some of the people, and hopefully not a very large proportion of the people who are currently laid off, will not get their jobs back. So the unemployment numbers can actually be much higher than that. And just noting that even with these very optimistic assumptions, the unemployment figure is doubling. The expectation is that if all the restrictions are gradually lifted around mid-April, the economy will actually rebound quite strongly, and we see here a projection for quite a positive outlook for 2021. This is assuming that really this outbreak of the coronavirus will be a one-time, and that there will be solutions by in some time, which would mean that there will not be any further restrictions going forward. One other aspect of the resilience of the Israeli economy, which also improves the probability of a fairly strong rebound going forward once restrictions are lifted, is that Israel has quite a lot of experience with shocks, with dealing with shocks, and with recovering from shocks. As you all know, once in a while we have security issues, we have some tension, and our experience is that usually once the calm is coming back, the economy tends to rebound quite quickly. And again, the fact that we have a solid financial system will help the economy recover once it is once the restrictions are over. But there is one very important element which will be very crucial in how the economy will recover, or the extent to which the economy recover and how quickly it will recover. And that's related to what will be the policy that the government will implement in order to alleviate the effect of the negative shock, and also to support the recovery once the restrictions are lifted. So far, the government announced several measures, and I will talk about them in a minute. But I would say that the overall magnitude of the government response has been relatively modest so far. The government has announced that it will increase substantially credit, which is government guaranteed credit, to small and medium businesses. This is a very important measure in order for small businesses to be able to sort of bridge for a time when they have no income. However, this measure requires also a personal guarantee for the credit, for these loans that are given by banks with government guarantee. But this personal guarantee may deter many small businesses who face huge uncertainty from actually utilizing this measure. Another policy that has been undertaken in order to alleviate the situation in the markets and to pump liquidity into the market are measures taken by the Bank of Israel, fairly diverse measures in order to support the flow of credit, the continued flow of credit by banks. Some regulations have been relaxed in order to allow banks to continue lending to people who are households and to small businesses who are in with a temporary difficulty, and they were encouraged to actually continue lending. And here, the fact that the banks have cushions of capital and liquidity is very important. Another measure taken by the central bank has been to purchase government bonds, a very large quantity, and this is supposed to reduce the yield on government bonds, and actually this signals the interest rate to all the credit market, and that has been again in support of actually having a smooth flow of credit in the time of need of credit. In terms of the government measures, those individuals who were laid off, temporarily laid off or permanently fired, will be eligible, all of them, to unemployment benefits. The government announced the reduction in the length of period that is needed or required in order to gain eligibility for unemployment benefits. And there is still a question regarding the period of eligibility, which in Israel is relatively modest. And I hope that the government will announce that eligibility will be extended at least until the period when the economy starts actually recovering and the restrictions are lifted. There has been some postponement of some measures, taxes, local taxes, and VAT taxes, but the postponement so far has been quite modest. I believe that in a short time, when further measures are announced, this will be also extended. There is one very serious obstacle for taking broader measures by the government and providing the fiscal stimulus that is necessary to deal with the current crisis. And that is the fact that, as you all know, we don't only have economic crisis and public health crisis, but also political crisis. And the current government is an interim government. It has not been able to pass a budget. And in fact, the government right now is operating on a temporary budget that is based on the previous year budget, on the budget of 2019, and it can only spend each month 1/12 of the budget for 2019. This budget has been very restrictive even before the crisis, but given the crisis and the extent of the crisis, the importance of actually having expansionary policy is really very crucial. And at the moment, unless there is an agreement within the Knesset to pass a budget, we are still operating with a very restrictive budget. This implies that if we do not pass a budget which allows to really increase the support to the unemployed, to businesses, to small businesses, and to all of those that are directly affected by the closure imposed by the government, we will have a pro-cyclical rather than an anti-cyclical fiscal policy. An anti-cyclical policy would mitigate the effect of the crisis. And you can see in the graph here that if the government takes very severe mitigating policy, very strong fiscal policy, it would flatten the curve. But this time we're talking about flattening the recession curve. So it's important to take measures that would flatten not only the public health curve, but also the recession curve. And I definitely hope that in light of this unprecedented health and economic crisis, our politicians will find a way to join hands to help Israel both to endure and recover from this crisis. So I'll stop here and I'll be very happy to take any questions.
Okay, so you can raise your digital hands if you want to make a questions. Okay, we have Peter, no, he disappeared. Okay, it's Slil Razuli. Please. Peter, okay, you can ask your question.
My question is, what you, first of all, thank you for this very thorough and interesting presentation. I'm interested in finding out what do you see as the impact on the private equity industry in Israel related obviously to high tech?
Well, I think that we will probably see some effect on the resources available to this industry, but it's too early to assess the overall impact. We will see an impact. By the way, we do see some impact on the industry, on the high-tech industry generally, also because of the inability to convene. And we know that usually investments are based also on personal interaction, and all the impediments to that are probably also affecting this industry. but I think it's too early to say what will be the effect, the overall effect on resources directed to this industry. I think there are some areas which are doing very well. All the technologies that we're now utilizing very extensively, and there are a lot of companies in Israel actually that are developing these technologies. I'm sure they're going to do very well.
Thank you.
Okay, we have now Tzlil Razuli. Tzlil.
Hey, hello. Hello?
Hi.
Hey. Economically speaking, do you think that like flattening the curve of the disease would affect the extent of the recession? Because as I understand, some other governments are acting as if it's an equation between an economical crisis or a public health crisis.
Well, I think that at the early stage, it didn't seem like there is a conflict when initially when the borders were closed, and in Israel, by the way, this was very effective because Israel is, for that matter, an island, and the initial restrictions seemed, and we were all hoping that they would be very short. There didn't seem to be a conflict between the extent of the restrictions and the economic considerations. I think at this stage, there seems to be some conflict, and I think that governments need to find some balance between the two, flattening the two curves. I think that implying further restrictions now on the fairly severely restricted as it is economic activity will probably increase the price in terms of the extent of the recession, and it will make recovering much more difficult.
Thank you.
Okay, we have now Atar Porat.
Hi, so we've been hearing a lot about, can you hear me?
Yes.
So we've been hearing a lot how one should protect themselves from the recession. You know, you should buy these stocks, you should invest in gold or stuff like that. And since none of us has ever lived through a major recession in our lives, I would suppose, what would you suggest to do to protect oneself against the upcoming recession?
Well, I'm not in the business of giving advice on how to invest or at what stage to go into the market or out of the market. I think the only thing is not to panic and to take very sort of decisions based on your needs, and also on we need strong nerves at this period. But I can't give investment advice.
Thank you.
Okay, we have now Omer F. Omer.
Hello. A common saying is that every crisis is also an opportunity. So in your opinion, what opportunities should the government take when dealing with this advice to conduct reforms or to make changes?
I think at the early stage of the recovery, we should definitely invest in infrastructure. In Israel, we have a lot of deficiencies in infrastructure, which are affecting our growth. And I think that a very thoroughly devised plan to speed up some of the major investments in infrastructure are definitely something that we will, that it would be good policy to support the recovery. I think there are some other areas which I think this crisis demonstrated that need to be looked at. For example, our public health, which has been, we have still a good public health system, but it has been neglected and I would say even starved for too long. That's something that we should also invest in, and investment in hospitals, in schools, and so on are areas that we need investment, and the recovery stage from a recession would be a good time to do that. There are some other areas. I think the fact that we can do a lot of our work from home, the potential there has been is growing, and I think this period demonstrates that the potential is only very partially actually utilized, and the encouragement to work from home can be very positive in terms of the environment. There would be less congestion in the roads and so on. So I think we will find a different mix. Even people my age are finding that actually you can do a lot with this technology, more than we were willing to try earlier on. So there are various areas, and I think that really at the stage of the recovery, we should invest wisely in areas which will support the growth of productivity in Israel, which has been a challenge for a long time.
תודה, Professor Flug.
Okay, we have now Amos Rimon.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, thank you for your lecture. It was interesting. I wanted to take a different angle to the question. We can see that the reaction of the US government is a lot less acute than the ones in Western Europe, in Italy and Germany, even in the UK recently. How do you think this will affect the Israeli market, since we are very codependent on the American one?
The approach you mean in terms of health or in terms of economic policy?
Of both.
Well, I think it's too early to say. I think on economic policy, actually, the package that was passed yesterday is of very substantial proportions, with the idea of doing exactly the kind of thing that would flatten the recession curve. But I think that one question that I don't have an answer on is whether the fact that so far it seems that there is not a very good control on actually knowing how many people have been affected, contracted the virus, and the health system doesn't seem to be handling, or there is not enough of a public health system to actually handle the situation. So I'm not sure what the result will be and whether it will prolong the period of eventually restrictions that will probably be imposed at a later stage and maybe for a longer period of time. So I think it's too early to assess whether it's working. I know that in Britain, they initially wanted to apply less severe measures, but very quickly they actually changed their approach, and now they're also implementing very strict measures of restricting activities and gatherings and so on.
Thank you very much.
We have Aviv Rosenman.
שומעים אותי? אני לא אביב רוזמן, אבל לא. Professor, I wanted to ask, are there any forecasts or precedents for what will happen to the economy of Israel if the current measures will go on for more than 3 or 5 months?
I haven't seen any estimates. I'm afraid that what we have seen until the end of May suggests a very deep recession. But looking at what is happening in China and in South Korea, I'm actually optimistic that the period or the duration of these very restrictive measures will not be very long. If they will need to be longer, I think the balance between the need to flatten the curve in terms of the number of people contracting the disease will be reassessed, because
Thank you very much.
the economic price will be too high.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Mario Blejer.
Yes, hi, Karnit. Actually, this is Minoshka Rajmohachi. Hi, Karnit, speaking for both of us, if you wish. Thank you so much. This was really brilliant and extremely timely in terms of understanding the challenges Israel itself faces because of the lack of a potentially aggressive fiscal policy, given the political impasse. And that's what really sets apart Israel, it seems to me. I am more familiar, working at the LSE, of the European context. So we'll see that in addition, of course, to the US big package, Germany announced a 5% of GDP stimulus, which is at the Eurozone, it translates into about 10 percentage point of GDP, which is not very big, but still much more than what we are talking about here. UK has announced a 5 percentage point of fiscal stimulus, and still the feeling on the continent is that it's still pretty small. So there is a substantial, but still pretty small relative, even from with the global financial crisis. So my question is that whether the Bank of Israel's even scariest scenario is not too optimistic. If you believe that there indeed needs to be a much bigger fiscal counter-cyclical push than what is happening even in the more aggressive countries, and what is not happening, as you described very clearly here in Israel. So in a sense, the 9%, even worst case scenario, end of May restrictions, may be an optimistic one, 9% decline, if there is no unit, an emergency budget and that is passed through with a very significant measure.
Yeah, I'm afraid that without a very substantial fiscal package, things will be, we will be in a deeper recession. I agree that this is crucial, and all the measures that have been announced so far, if there is no new budget, it means that they will come at the expense of other expenditures, and the 2019 budget, which is the budget that is now operating for 2020, has already been very restricted in many areas. As you know, even just for population growth, you have to have a higher budget. But certainly, if you have to divert resources to the health system and to the police and to all the agencies that directly deal with the crisis, it means that there is going to be very little, if anything, that can be actually allocated to help businesses. And I certainly agree that if there is no very substantial fiscal package, our recession might be much deeper.
Okay, so we have now Philippos Papatanos.
Hi there, can you hear me? Thanks so much for your very clear presentation. I have kind of two questions. One is, what is the importance of the relative timing of reactivation of our economy? Like, if we think of it as a reactivation, what is the importance of the timing of this in relation to other countries, right? Like, at the moment, we are all talking, except maybe Trump, of closing down our economies. India is doing it, South Africa is doing it, most of Western Europe is doing it. When does it make sense to do that? And my other question is regarding the two curves, and like, what are the policies that we need to take regarding the two curves? I mean, some things are going to affect both curves in a positive way. For example, credit, financial support to individuals, small businesses, corporation industries. But some will be in opposition. For example, if you want to help consumption, you're going to have to risk the population. So what do you think are the cost-benefit analysis that need to be going on right now in the government?
Yeah. So I think for flattening the first curve, it's clear that the more you restrict movement and the more you restrict the people being together in a factory or in any type of business, the slower will be the process of actually less interactions you have, the flatter you will have the first curve, which is the curve of people getting the disease. But the more you restrict activity, the more severe is the extent to which you have an output loss. And that was actually in the estimate made by the Bank of Israel. They talked about 35% of shutdown or 50% of shutdown. So I think clearly if these restrictions are more severe, the extent to which the decline in activity will be, it will show in a more severe decline in activity. There may be a trade-off between, and that I'm not sure that I have a good answer about, if it would be clear that you can have a complete shutdown, but for a very short period of time, and that is it. There, I think the trade-off between a very severe shutdown for a very short period of time or a partial shutdown for a slightly longer period, that's where there is a trade-off, which I'm not sure that I have a good answer about. Now, regarding your, I'm not sure which trade-off you talked about in your second question.
I was just asking, what are the policies that the government needs to be considering at the moment? I mean, clearly they have decided to lower both curves, to lower the mortality curve at the moment, or the health curve at the moment. But, for example, doing a big investment and a big bailout package will also flatten the curve of the economic or the recessionary crisis.
Yeah, flattening the recession curve is actually by doing the kind of policies that we talked about, a major fiscal package, which will include support for the unemployed, support for the self-employed. By the way, I didn't get into all the details, but for example, people who are over retirement age, if they work, they're not eligible for any unemployment benefit. That could be extended. The period for which people get unemployment benefit in Israel is quite short. That might have to be extended. And I think there is a room also for some direct support for some businesses that were most directly and severely affected by the closure. On top of that, I think very large sums, very large loans and credit, access to credit with government guarantee can also help, again, bridge over this period so that these businesses will actually be there once the restrictions are lifted. We want to give them the breathing, the ability to breathe for this period in which they don't have any income, so that they will be able to reopen once they're back. Now, another policy that can help that is of the people that are laid off, about 90% are temporarily laid off. One measure that could help actually businesses to get these people back to work is the initial stage at which they get back to work. If they get them back, their wage could be subsidized. That would not entail much further cost for the government, because the government, in any case, pays unemployment benefits to these people. So this unemployment benefit could be converted to wage subsidy for those businesses that reopen and rehire these people who were temporarily laid off. That's an important measure that can be very effective at the recovery stage.
Thank you.
Okay, we have now Gil Schneider. Gil? Gil? Okay.
Good evening. You hear me?
Now we hear you.
Okay, good evening, Professor, and thanks for the interesting presentation. I'm wondering what will be the consequences in case of Israel in your optimistic scenario will go back on track in the end of April or in the end of May, while the other economics such as Europe and United States will stay behind. How will Israeli economic will be affected from this?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Israel is a small open economy, and given that, it is quite exposed to what's happening in the global trade. And the optimistic scenario assumes that gradually also the rest of the global economy is recovering and world trade is recovering. If world trade does not recover and the global economy generally recover with a very shallow or very slow recovery, that will slow down the recovery of the Israeli economy. About 30-something% of our output is exports. And we need the markets to be there in order for this exports to actually also contribute to the recovery. So the extent of the recovery, the strength of the recovery will definitely depend, among other things, also on the global economy.
Thank you.
Okay, David Wallach.
Yes, good evening. I would like to know how you see the weakness of the shekel. What is the justification for the weakness of the shekel, and how do you see it performing after this pandemic?
Yeah, well, the shekel has weakened somewhat in the last 3 weeks, although it had been fluctuating quite a bit. I have to say that when I heard you talking about the weakness of the shekel, it sounded strange to me, because during my tenure and also as a governor and also until 3 weeks ago, one of the concerns of the Bank of Israel had been the strength of the shekel. Now, the recent weakness has to do with the investment of institutional investors abroad, that as a result of the decline in the value of assets, there needed actually to close some of their exposure in terms of foreign exchange. But I've already seen the shekel actually somewhat strengthening back. It's the fact that the Bank of Israel actually injected liquidity also in foreign exchange helped alleviate this temporary pressure on the shekel, which, by the way, the fact that Israel has large foreign currency reserves, the Bank of Israel has large foreign currency reserves, is very helpful, and also is, I would say, another factor that helps the resilience of the economy, because there is the ability to use the reserves if you need, both for liquidity or if there would be any other needs related to the crisis.
And how do you see the future of the currency going? Because really, if you compare it, I must say, if you compare the handling of Israel of the pandemic by comparison to other countries, like in Europe or even the States or Canada, I think Israel is doing pretty well. So I question why there should be a weakness in the currency. And I wonder what you think about the future of the currency.
Yeah, so the weakness of the currency, I already said, it's related to the exposure of institutional investors abroad. Regarding the future of the currency, I will not try to speculate.
Thank you.
Okay, Jonathan Lux.
Thank you. I think my question has effectively been answered with the last question. But thank you, Professor, for your excellent talk.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we have Daniel Farkas.
Hi, how are you? Good night.
Hello.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yeah, it's slightly interrupted, but let's try.
No, I think it doesn't work. So let's go to Barak Sass.
Hi, yes, thank you for your time. My question is a global question. Do you think that we will see a trend toward Keynesian economy? And if so, do Western governments, especially in Europe, have the resources to do that?
Whether we'll see Keynesian economics, you mean measures, fiscal stimulus, that's, I guess, what you have in mind. And what we've been seeing around the world is actually large stimulus packages being implemented. I'm not sure that I know that is the case for most of the economies, but many economies that we've been following are adopting very expansionary fiscal policies. Whether they will have the resources to do it, they will have to, I mean, I can talk about the case of Israel.
Okay.
And in our case, we will see a very substantial increase in the deficit. We will probably see a substantial rise in our debt to GDP ratio. It took a long time to get it down to 60%. It will probably go up to around 70% or even more by the time this crisis is over. And that means that there will be a need to start fiscal consolidation program once we have recovered. But I think that the cost of not doing this Keynesian fiscal policy will be much more severe. So I think that this is what we've learned since the Great Depression, that fiscal policy, large stimulus works to get an economy out of a deep recession.
Thank you.
Okay, we will have now our last question, Mr. Glasner.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. I'm wondering, Professor, if you have, or the Bank of Israel has been running any models in regard to stimulus that's been created by all nations around the world, and the unintended consequences that that may occur once we get past the virus and going down the timeline in the future. Should we be more concerned about dramatic deflation or creating uncontrollable inflation? That's an existential question for sure, but I'd like you to try to give your best answer on that.
Yeah, it's a very big question. I'm not aware of a global model at the Bank of Israel. My sense is that, again, I can talk about the Israeli case. And we have not seen, or maybe even more broadly, during the global financial crisis, in order to avoid an even deeper crisis, governments took very substantial measures, both monetary and fiscal. And I think that in areas where these measures were decisive and substantial, they helped to actually reduce the duration of the crisis, of the recession, and they supported the recovery, and we've not seen inflation. So I think that I wouldn't worry at this stage about inflation.
So it's something for the future to worry about.
Yeah, I think that once we will recover, we will need to go back to normal or start a process of normalization in the monetary front, which some countries were in the process of this normalization before some new shocks derailed them from this normalization. And we will need to start a fiscal consolidation program. But I think that at this stage, we should focus our efforts on how to avoid a deeper recession than worry about the future consequences. I think there will be time to deal with those. I think we have very immediate problems to deal with right now.
And hopefully we have good leaders at all the central banks in the world.
I certainly agree that good leaders are very necessary.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you to everybody. Thank you a lot, Professor Flug. And hope to meet you tomorrow for the next webinar, and you will receive the invitation for the next week webinars very soon. Thank you to all and good evening.
Thank you. Thanks.